The next time period we're going to look at is the Baroque period. The Baroque period begins around 1600. Now, if you've taken Reformed to modern church history, you might not recall Baroque period because it's typically not going to be emphasized in a church history class covering this time period. It might be mentioned in a textbook, it might be mentioned in class, but you're not going to see as great an emphasis on this time period. In fact, it's primarily an artistic movement. So why would we want to look at the Baroque period in a worship leadership class? Well, really for two reasons. First of all, you might recall at the very beginning of our history lectures, I talked about how we want to look at worship in dialogue or in response to major geopolitical movements. And as we've walked through the history of worship, and then as we get to 1200 and we begin to see the rise of the West, we've been looking at these major geopolitical movements and how worship responds to these movements. Along with the major geopolitical movements, we also want to make note of the cultural milieu in which worship is occurring. And such is the case with the Baroque period. There are implications and associations with geopolitical movements, but certainly the Baroque period is a major cultural hegemonic in this time period that we're seeing the church respond to. Now, the other reason that we would want to look at the Baroque period is it actually helps us understand the transition from Renaissance to Enlightenment. And so it can help serve as an important bridge just to get your mind around how history is progressing from 1400 to the eventual explosion of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Now, the beginning of the Baroque period actually helps us with this transition. The Baroque period begins with a group of scholars in Florence. Now, don't forget that in the Renaissance period, the two key Italian cities that sort of launched us into Renaissance were Florence and Venice. Well, there's a group of intellectuals in Florence. This group includes Galileo's father. It includes a very famous singer, Caccini, and other intellectuals. And they discuss a range of topics. But one of the topics they end up discussing is how were the Greek tragedies originally performed. And to find out the answer to that question, they wrote to the top scholar on Greek tragedies of their time. And his name was May. He was located in Rome. And May concluded that the Greek tragedies were originally sung from beginning to end. Now, we actually know now that May was wrong. So it's one of these little curious moments in history where, because of bad advice from a scholar, a whole movement gets started. So you might have already guessed, if May thought the tragedy should be sung from beginning to end, these scholars decide to support the creation of the first opera. The very first opera was by Peri. He was more of a singer-songwriter. He wrote songs with lute. It would be not terribly far from what we would conceive of as of a singer-songwriter today, someone who writes songs with guitar. But the first production was not super elaborate. Then we have Monteverdi, who is a bona fide composer. And his first opera is grand in its scale. It involves a lot more people, singers, instruments. And I find this interesting in and of itself. You can see a parallel even there with contemporary worship, using a smaller group, a more intimate setting, versus a larger group with big worship production. Some of these cultural realities could be traced even to this time period and the time periods we've looked at before this. Now, in relationship to Baroque period, the primary thing I would want you to make note of for testing is two principles that come out of this period, and they are absolutism in science. In fact, in the Baroque period, we are seeing the rumblings of a coming collision between absolutism and science. Now, I want to take some time to make sure you understand what I mean by absolutism and science. So absolutism is not a new idea, not a totally new idea in the Baroque period. In some ways, I would trace it back to Charlemagne, who is appointed as the Holy Roman Emperor. It's the idea of a God-appointed ruler, a divinely appointed ruler. And what that would suggest is that the divinely appointed ruler is not to be questioned. Now, some might think or might suggest that Henry VIII contributed to this by declaring himself to be the head of the Church of England and declaring that he was not under the authority of the Pope. In a way, that sort of foreshadowed where we were going with the Baroque period of this idea of absolute rule. But in this period of time, from 1600 to 1750, the quintessential absolute ruler is no doubt Louis XIV. When you see a picture of Louis XIV, it is grand pomp and circumstance. He is quite elaborate in his dress. And Louis knows how to use pomp and circumstance for his purposes. He certainly believes he is a divinely appointed ruler. An example of this would be during his developmental years, ballet was a big deal in the French courts. Now don't think of ballet in the way you might observe it if you go see a production. I have a daughter who does ballet, and the dancers are on the stage, and you sit in the audience and observe this. Ballet at this time involved a participation in the evening's events. So, yes, a story is unfolding, but there's food, there's interaction, and there's a storyline that has been scripted. So this is quite a grand affair. And Louis XIV was actually a featured dancer during his early years. Well, as these events are occurring, as he gets older, he notices that his mother is often manipulated by political figures from other parts of Europe, for example, Italy, as they are in the courts of the French on a continuous basis. So Louis is determined to not allow these political figures outside of France to continue to have the influence they had during his mother's era. So he actually uses the pomp and circumstance of something like a ballet to create such a response of awe, or perhaps even an opera, to create such a sense of awe that he's doing some political maneuvering under the table, and it's not really noticed because he is hosting the visitors so well. Now, our example of science is going to be with music. Now, science, of course, had been on the rise. It begins to be on the rise all the way back to the rediscovery of Aristotle. As Aristotle is highlighted and he begins to be discussed philosophically, it's not surprising that not long after the church leaders were writing about Aristotle and talking about truth from below, that we have some amazing breakthroughs in science and science philosophy with folks like Sir Isaac Newton or Sir Francis Bacon. These are just amazing scientific thinkers. So science is beginning to occur, but the evolution of science and the expansion of science begins to touch every area of life. And so music would be an example of this. Toward the end of this period, towards 1750, Bach illustrates how science has come to music. Believe it or not, up to this point, a tuning system had not been developed that would allow you to go from any one key to any other key you wanted to go to. Well, a new tuning system is developed. It's called equal temporal tuning. And Bach illustrates through a collection of pieces called the Well-Tempered Clavier that you could tune the harpsichord one time and go from any one key into any other key. This science will actually have implications for later music and even the way we transition in different keys in modern day worship. But the point of bringing up right now is just to illustrate that in this time period, you have a celebration of absolutism and a celebration of science. However, they are bound to collide, and we will see that happening very soon. Now, one other thing I want to mention to you before we move into Enlightenment is the rise of Pietism. Pietism ends up rising in the midst of the Baroque period, but Pietism has more to do with what's happening geopolitically in Europe. You have in the era of the 1600s, the 30 Years' War. And this was a devastating war for much of Europe. And it actually caused a lot of doubt about whether some of the Orthodox beliefs were worth going to war over. There's a lot of questioning of that. It also led people to desire a more personal relationship with Christ, to seek out what is the point of these newfound ideas related to Christianity that's taking us back to an actual New Testament understanding. What's the point? It's not to go to war with one another. So the Pietists arise out of the 30 Years' War, and they are Orthodox. So I certainly would want to emphasize that they're not compromising in terms of their Orthodox beliefs, but they are more personal in their approach to their relationship with Christ. They see it as more of a personal faith. Now, the primary figure who we think of as leading us into Pietism is Spencer. He forms these little devotional groups that are encouraged to explore their relationship with Christ, to go deeper in their relationship with Christ, and to hold one another accountable. Another figure associated with this movement is Count Zinzendorf. Count Zinzendorf becomes aware of the movement through a family member, through a grandmother who is interested in the movement, but he becomes even more exposed to the movement as he is pursuing a degree at the University of Wittenberg. So Zinzendorf becomes an important Pietist leader. Now, the reason I wanted to mention Count Zinzendorf is there's an interesting connection with worship that happens between Zinzendorf and a group of very early reformers from what is today the Czech Republic. These are the Bohemian Brethren. Now, the Bohemian Brethren formed very early in the Reformation. They were even like a precursor to the Reformation. But at this period of time, due to some geopolitical circumstances, they were having to flee the Czech Republic. Count Zinzendorf finds out about this, and he sets up a portion of his land. He is aristocracy, so he's quite wealthy and controls large swaths of land. He sets up a portion of his land called Herrnhut, where they are allowed to reside. And he actually gives up his aristocratic duties to go hang out with these folks. He essentially becomes a worship leader. And we know from historical records that in addition to being caught up in the pietistic movement in terms of the implications for personal discipleship and sincere devotion in one's commitment to Christ, that singing also becomes a big part of this retreat that he creates. Some tremendous things come out of this this community that Count Zinzendorf helps form, and we're going to see his influence even in many years later as we continue to walk through the history of worship. Now, another figure I want to mention, Paul Gearhart. Paul Gearhart actually comes at the very beginning of the Pietist movement. Some might not strictly consider him to be a Pietist, but in the way he's responding with worship music that he writes, coming out of the 30 Years' War, we see many of the characteristics of what Pietism is going to become. So Gearhart is sort of an early indicator that we are headed toward Pietism. And I did want to mention his name because of his influence as a very important German songwriter. Not to be confused, by the way, with another Gearhart who is a theologian roughly within this time frame. So this is Paul Gearhart. Now, I do want you to make note of a hymn focus that comes out of the Pietist movement, and that's praise to the Lord the Almighty. In fact, an examination of this hymn will give you a good idea of what we mean by Pietism. There is orthodoxy clearly communicated in this great hymn of the faith. Praise to the Lord the Almighty. This big picture of who God is. I often and have put this hymn at the beginning of a worship service to communicate the transcendence of God, the big picture of who He is, high and holy Creator God. But when I found out that this hymn was influenced by pietistic thinking, having been written by Neander, I went back and noticed that there are some lines of incredible intimacy in this hymn, that he shelters thee under His wings. So I encourage you to go look at the words of this hymn, maybe even include it in your devotional life at some point this semester, and consider how you have both orthodox teaching and a strong sense of personal relationship with Christ that comes through this powerful hymn of the faith. Now we're going to begin looking at the Enlightenment, which begins in earnest in the 18th century. Now, I should note for you that the Baroque period is still going on. So this is one of the complicated things when you begin to delve into the major time periods in the history of Western Europe. Just because a new time period has started doesn't mean that the previous time period is not still going on. And this is a really clear case of that. So Baroque period is continuing up until 1750, but underneath it we have Enlightenment. So when you think about Enlightenment, I primarily, in terms of things you want to note and keep up with, I want you to primarily think about the Enlightenment as a broadening or a spreading of scientific and philosophical ideas that were in the hands of just a few folks before this time period. Now, several things occur that allow for this to happen. Some of this is related to the rising of the middle class, or as the French call it, the bourgeoisie. The rising of the bourgeoisie is a perfect setting for this to happen. Another factor is the increasing use of the printing press so that ideas can get out there rather quickly. But we also want to give credit to the French. It's interesting that right under the nose of the descendants of Louis XIV, there is an uprising of ideas that will eventually lead to the French Revolution. But it starts much earlier than that. It starts early in the 18th century as thinkers in France sat around cafes in Paris and perhaps even over coffee, discussed ideas that were going on in the world. And they begin to publish their ideas in what's called an encyclopedia. Now, they didn't originate the encyclopedia, but these French thinkers truly made it ubiquitous in their region, and their influence there carries over even to the present. In fact, often in a live class, I will ask this question of the class: how many of you had a piano in your home growing up? And Now, this is less so with the invention of electronic keyboards, but often many in the room, let's say half in the room, will raise their hands. Then I will ask if you had an encyclopedia in your home. Now, that question is changing a bit. If you're talking about somebody in my generation, you'll see a lot of hands going up on the encyclopedia being in the home. Of course, now that an encyclopedia is on our phone, we don't need it, the full volume set in our home. But I'll bet for many of you, if your parents are in the baby boomer age, you probably would still find encyclopedias in their home. So the influence of the French is quite strong for quite some time, even up into the 20th century and beyond. So we have these French thinkers who are spreading their ideas through published materials. Now, I want to draw your attention to one of these French thinkers. There are several that you might want to study on your own, such as Voltaire. But for our purposes, we're going to look just at Rousseau. And there's a reason for doing that. Rousseau, even though he wrote on several topics, he became aware of a development that had happened in Naples. Now, we're going back to Italy here, and I want you to be aware that here we are into the 18th century, and still Italy is having a very strong influence. In fact, I like to encourage students to try to categorize the unfolding history based on regions. You might even find it helpful to, if you're a visual person, to pull up a map and to think about the progression of history based on regions. In the 1200s, we had the French were very, very influential with the rise of Notre Dame. Then the Italians became influential in the Renaissance period. They're continuing to be very influential. The French, to be honest, remain as a powerful influence. As we get into the 18th century, we're eventually going to get to German influence. But at this point in time, we have this powerful influence of the French and the rise of Enlightenment, but the Italians are still players. And here's an example. Here's the example of how this plays out. So there is a new type of opera being done. It's called an intermezzi. Now remember that opera is invented in 1600. It helps propel us into the Baroque period. But along with the idea of absolutism from the Baroque period, operas never questioned the authority of the king. What operas became as they developed and were used in all the courts of Europe, including courts of Louis XIV, what they became is tributes to the king of that particular region or to the ruler of that city or area. And here's what I mean by that. Many times the operas were based on Greek tragedies. At least the Greeks were honest in their stories about tragic flaws within their leaders. But they were actually changing the storyline so that the monarch always appeared to be flawless or good or righteous. And you can imagine these make for really bad stories. The stories are not very good. In fact, eventually people are just coming to the operas to hear elaborate solos. They're not even really paying attention to the storyline. Well, what happens in Naples is there is a composer by the name of Pergolesi, and he writes an intermezzi. An intermezzi is really the precursor to comic opera, so you could think of it as comic opera. He writes this intermezzi that's titled La Serva Padrona. And the title of the opera gives away what's new. The translation is The Mistress Maid. Now here's what's meant by that. In this short opera, in this intermezzi, by the way, intermezzi just means these acts were performed in the intermission of a bigger opera. So that's why I say it's a shorter opera and eventually becomes the comic opera. So the story is you have a maid, she's actually a maid, but she's pretending to be a mistress. Now don't think of how you would use the word mistress in modern times. Think of mistress as meaning aristocracy. So you actually have a maid who's pretending to be aristocracy. Well, this is a problem, and this is a new idea in a storyline. You see, there's a saying that the writers of art go by, and those who associate themselves with aristocracy. And I got this, by the way, from the legendary Dr. Sanchez, who used to teach music history at University of Southern Mississippi. The phrase goes like this: kings may play clowns, but clowns must never play kings. So you can see how that plays out with absolutism. If King Louis wants to get drunk and act like a fool, that's his business. Nobody's going to question that. But if you are the clown, if you are the artist, you do not make fun of the king. It is not allowed. So what you have in this case is you have the writer of the opera is actually making fun of the aristocracy because the maid is pretending to be a mistress. Well, Rousseau goes to watch this opera, and he knows immediately that this is going to be great material to build on. So he writes an encyclopedia article about the opera, about the ideas being presented, and then he writes comic opera himself. Now this is powerful to consider because once you begin laughing at aristocracy, it's only going to be a moment in time before we are condemning aristocracy. In fact, if you go just a few decades later when comic opera is in its full-fledged identity, Mozart writes a comic opera called Don Giovanni, in which not only are we laughing at the Don, now the Don is a silly character. So at the time, Joseph II, who's considered an enlightened monarch, maybe he's able to appreciate it at some level. But I can certainly tell you that he does not appreciate the fact that at the end of the opera, the Don Giovanni, is condemned to hell. So now we're going beyond just laughing at aristocracy, we're actually condemning aristocracy. So I think art helps us sometimes to understand the implications of cultural movements. And I do want you to think about such things and explore such things, but the power in this also for you as a worship leader today is to note that that's happening in our own time. That in a similar way, cultural movements and art can be used to get worldviews out there. And that our worship should be the right worldview being communicated, and we certainly would want to protect it from these other cultural hegemonics that rise up among us. Now, the other thing I want to point out to you in the midst of Enlightenment is that we don't necessarily think of Bach as an enlightened composer, but enlightened ideas are making their way even to Protestant Germany. So we do have, once Enlightenment begins, Bach, who technically is a Baroque composer, reaching a zenith of sacred art achievement. So again, for your notes, you're going to want to make note of Bach and how he is an ultimate art example of bringing together specifics for the ultimate glory of God. Now I'm going to illustrate this for you quite briefly here. For one thing, we'd have to recognize that I'm not the first person to recognize Bach's preeminence. You have Schweitzer, for example, who recognizes the St. Matthew Passion as one of the greatest works of art of all time. In other words, he's taking the greatest works of art in any category, architecture, visual painting, whatever you might conceive of. And he puts Bach's St. Matthew Passion right up there with, say the top 5 or the top 10 greatest works of art of all time. Schweitzer's not the only one to say that, but carries a lot of weight coming from Albert Schweitzer. But in regard to this statement about Bach may be the ultimate art example of bringing together specifics for the ultimate glory of God, I actually see this portrayed powerfully in in Bach Cantata 106. So in Bach Cantata 106, Movement 5, we see a very interesting coming together of theological concepts, of tremendous Baroque art, and perhaps even enlightened influence. I suggest enlightened influence based on some reading by the tremendous church historian Pelikan, who did write a brief book on Bach called Bach Among Theologians, if you want to explore some of this further. Well, Cantata 106 is actually a funeral cantata. And we don't have a ton of material for funerals among Protestants. We're certainly not going to use the Catholic Requiem Mass. So we've kind of been in a struggle up even to the present to know what materials should we use for funerals. So I find this to be a very interesting research as far as an early model on how Protestants handle funerals. So you have a funeral cantata, or what we think is a funeral cantata in Bach 106. But in the fifth movement, these ideas come to bear and come to relate to one another. The opening line of Bach Cantata 106, fifth movement, it is the old decree. It is the old decree that man is going to die. So what you see there at the beginning of this movement is law, the inevitability of law, that we are going to die. Thus a funeral cantata. But Bach is very interestingly using an interval that one is not supposed to use according to what musicians call common practice. It's just a writing feature that you don't use. In fact, when we teach theory here, we tell students in common practice you don't write this interval, and it's called a tritone. It's a difficult interval in terms of the tension that it creates. A tritone. So immediately it would have struck the ears as a curse. So he puts this melodic curse, if you will, into it is the old decree. Well, the parts, the alto, tenor, and bass, they begin to work out these ideas in contrapuntal fashion. It's like the law working itself out. But then very soon there's a counter melody that enters, and the counter melody has the words, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." So you have boy sopranos who come in almost as an angelic voice to say, over this reality of the law and death, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." So they're speaking to the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and providing us eternal life even though we're under the curse. Already there's a lot going on here with this distinct melody being intertwined with the curse melody. But as though that's not enough, Bach also brings in an instrumental hymn. It's not a hymn tune we know, but for the average Protestant German, they knew this hymn. It would be like having Amazing Grace play in the background. So it would have brought great comfort to them as the wind instruments play this very common chorale. So again, we have Bach bringing together specifics, the specifics being theology specifics, like a good Orthodox theology. Perhaps even pietism at play with this comforting melody undergirding what's going on. Solid personal connection, but also solid orthodoxy with the grace theme of the boy sopranos. And all of this is working itself out. And perhaps even, this might be a bit of a leap, but Pelikan points out that Bach is living in a time of enlightenment when people are beginning to question their faith. So perhaps even in this movement, as Bach is wrestling with death, perhaps even Bach is showing how to wrestle with science in this movement, to say, at the point of death, at that time of greatest questioning, that we can have the comfort of the Lord Jesus. And the worship music helps with that. So again, just a tremendous work, Bach Cantata 106. But the main thing you need to be aware of is that Bach may be the ultimate art example of bringing together specifics for the ultimate glory of God. in terms of how did these denominational or theological movements affect worship, well, we've already looked at that at Bach to some degree. But we also want to recognize, and this is hard for me to admit because I'm a choir guy, okay? I love Bach. But I have to be honest with you and admit to you that this period of time that I would see as like a golden age of sacred music writing, Protestant Germany in the 1700s, I would have to admit to you that they got so caught up with the elaborate music making that congregational participation was beginning to wane. And I hate to have to admit that to you, but that is the reality. So we see this curious pattern. We talked a little bit about this in our review of the Middle Ages. But we see this pattern where, not necessarily from bad motives, but when we have the artistic resources to make worship more interesting. Now remember, we've talked about this from interest to clarity scale, that when we have the resources to make worship more interesting, sometimes we make it so interesting that either it's not accessible from a theological clarity standpoint, that would be the case with the Lord's Supper and what Roman Catholics did with the Lord's Supper, but sometimes from a musical standpoint, we make things so interesting that they're not accessible anymore. I would suggest to you that this is what happened with the modern worship movement. Listen, I was there when it was breaking out, when Passion Movement was breaking out, before we were calling it a Passion Movement. I remember doing in Florida in the early 2000s, Waves of Mercy, and all these worship songs that were coming out, and it was a tremendous time of renewal in worship. I think the motives of folks who were leading at this time were quite strong. No issues there whatsoever. But I think what happened sometime between the late 90s and the 2000s, as worship music became more and more something that was played on the radio, it was something that was even popular to listen to, at least among evangelical Christians, that the production side of worship became higher and higher and higher. And what I noticed, now maybe not in your church, but what I notice in some churches today is if you look around the room with contemporary worship, there's always going to be that group of folks on the first two rows. And they're going to be enthusiastically participating. They're singing, their hands are raised, not questioning at all the sincerity of their response. But if you look around the church, if you look around the room in many of our churches, you have other folks who are not participating, particularly men. And what you're going to see is they're going to be standing there with their hands in their pockets. And you might even ask them afterwards, well, how did you enjoy the worship? And they might say, oh, I loved the worship. I thought it was great. But they're not participating. You see, we ended up creating a mindset that if we just have people stand for music for 20 to 30 minutes, they're automatically participating. I get why that's the case, because I can also remember the 80s and 90s when we would stand up, sit down, and it was breaking up the worship, and we wanted to create this continuous flow of worship. So it was a good idea to do that, but again, what happened with increasing production, I think, in many of our churches is we're simply having people stand and observe worship. They're not actually participating. So here's what I want you to consider, because I suspect that for some of you, in listening to what I just described with Bach, you might say to yourself, well, that's interesting, but you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound like worship to me. What I want to suggest to you is this. If the German parishioner let's say in the 1740s, listening to a tremendous Bach cantata, like Bach Cantata 106, if they're sitting down observing and letting the worship wash over them, and if you ask them afterwards, how did you enjoy that? They'd say, oh, it's a powerful worship experience. How is that any different than the 25-year-old male in our contemporary worship services who stands through 30 minutes of music, tells us after the service he enjoys it, but doesn't participate? So my point is to warn you that we have this tendency, we absolutely have this tendency of allowing the worship to become so interesting that it's no longer accessible. So I have another hero from roughly the same time period who is not the person that invented the English hymn. We'd have to give more credit to others, such as Keach, for really introducing the English hymn, but Watts is certainly the person who perfects the English hymn. In fact, Watts would have to be considered by many as the high point of English hymnody. To find out more about Watts, by the way, I do highly encourage Eskew and McElrath's Sing with Understanding. Dr. Eskew was a music professor here at NOBTS for quite a long time, and we continue to celebrate his writing, and there's several points throughout this history where I've drawn some things from Dr. Eskew, so appreciate his contributions to the field. Now, Watts is the high point simply because of the exemplary nature of his hymn writing. I mean, you can just look through your Baptist hymnal and see the great number of hymns he's contributed. But he wrote in two primary areas. One of them was an approach to psalm settings. He sort of revised the approach to psalm settings. So I do want to make you aware, he's absolutely Calvinist influenced. He's a part of this English church and what's happening with the English church and how to respond as a Protestant, as a Reformed thinker in the midst of this English church movement. So Watts, being Reformed in his thinking, wants to emphasize the Psalms, but he's going to give himself a little more license than other Calvinists might. And here's how he does this. For one thing, he is allowing for reasonable paraphrase of a psalm. And he's going to give a high Christological theme to his psalm settings. His psalms constantly point to Christ. He's also going to give himself some license in terms of things like geographical references. So he will insert wording or references that would have made more geographical sense to an English speaker. So that's part of what I mean by the paraphrase. He's allowing for some cultural considerations to be made in his wording. Now, a great example of this type of writing by Watts is Joy to the World. Okay? Now, you think of this as a Christmas hymn. But in reality, this hymn is based on a psalm. It's based on one of the great enthronement psalms. In this case, Psalm 96. So this particular hymn, being based on Psalm 96, go back and look at it and notice that we've decided to make it related to Christmas time. But in reality, it's a tremendous paraphrase of that psalm. And the last verse even speaks in eschatological terms, right? He rules the world in truth and grace. So you've got this high Christology coming out of this enthronement psalm, cast in a way that exalts Christ. And you're going to see other examples of this by Watts, like, O God, our help in ages past. Now, the other type of writing that Watts did is devotional lyrical poetry. So he's really getting beyond the bounds of what Calvinists would have typically allowed for by only allowing for Scripture to be sung in church with a song like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. And we're so glad he took that risk. For me personally, this might be my favorite hymn. It could arguably be the greatest English hymn ever written, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross. So we do want you to make note of Watts. So make particular note of Watts and how he is a preeminent English hymn writer, the perfecter of the English hymn, if you will. Do make particular note of that.